you actually feel like you're making a bigger impact on patients' lives than I did when I worked in the NHS.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Clinical Pharmacist podcast. For those of you joining us for the first time today, my name's Ruhina, and I am the CEO of Clinical Pharmacist Solutions. And as always, I'm joined by my lovely co-host, Sarah Dekmak, our COO. Today, we are continuing our Entrepreneurship and Alternative Pharmacist Careers Pathway series, where we've been joined by a number of pharmacists who have done something very unique or had a very different journey along their way. Today, we are joined by Danielle Brightman, the Clinical Director at Numan, a UK digital health company where she leads across clinical product, governance, operations, and regulatory compliance. Danielle has built a really interesting career at the intersection of pharmacy, digital health, and leadership. And in this episode, we explore how she's navigated that journey and what roles actually look like in this space. Danielle, it's really great to have you with us here today. If you could start by just telling us a little bit about your journey and how you got to where you are today.
Hiya, and thanks so much for having me. Yeah, of course. So I started out, I did my pre-registration pharmacy in hospital. Then I moved on straight into continuing hospital, going into the Band 6 rotations. I went straight into doing my postgraduate diploma and then spent nearly a decade in the NHS where I covered various different Band 7 roles, which were medicines information, education and training. And I spent a lot of my time in acute medicine on the post-take board round, which is where I learned a lot about prioritization and thinking on your feet. I then moved onto a Band 8 role, which was at Whittington Hospital, where I led the pharmacy acute medicine team. And that's where I also looked after a home oxygen service as well for the community. Throughout the period of COVID, that's where within the acute medicine team, we transitioned into working in a very much high dependency unit. And I spent a lot of time supporting the team, managing the clinical trials and the patients coming through with COVID. Towards the end of COVID, that's where I started to think, what else is there for me? A lot of my time in hospital was coaching and training fresh-faced pharmacists coming into the hospital career path and working within the respiratory medicine, where I did my prescribing, and acute medicine. But I was really looking for another opportunity where I could innovate more, I could build things, and was looking for an opportunity to make real changes within the areas that I was working in. And that's where Numan came along. So Numan were advertising for a clinical lead. They were a couple of years old as a company, CQC regulated, and they were looking to grow their permanent clinical team. So the role was a clinical operations and clinical governance role. And from the job description, it seemed like something I could easily transition into. The harder decision was more moving away from the NHS and away from the public sector, which is what I'd always known, and moving into private, which I think is quite a scary concept, especially when you've been in hospital setting for over 10 years. But I decided that it was a step and an opportunity that I wanted to take. So moved into Numan. And that's where I was predominantly looking after the CQC regulation side and also clinical governance in general, which is pretty much bread and butter as a pharmacist. But this is where I started noticing that there was a gap. So I got the opportunity to work with so many different functions that I'd never even really knew about before. So I started learning about commercial, brand, marketing, engineering, and this other function called product, and started working with a product manager. And I learned a lot about what all of these different functions do, how they work together. And I noticed that there was one function that was missing, which was the clinical aspect. And we were working in a healthcare company. And being on the receiving end of changes that were being made by the product team on our clinical tooling, where I was sort of being the person that all the clinicians escalated to, being like, why has something changed on the tooling? What's happening? What's going on with the clinical program? I started speaking more and more to the product manager. And that's where I noticed that there was a gap in that there was no clinical person involved in the development of our programs or being consulted in the tooling that we were using. And sort of, I suppose, fast forward to today, that's how I managed to grow the clinical products team, where I identified the gap and showed that there was a real opportunity to have a discipline of clinical product in a health tech company. I then transitioned from head of clinical product to director of clinical product, and then more recently, over the last year, clinical director. So this is where I've got, like you say, the clinical ops, clinical governance, and clinical product all under one roof.
So that's really exciting. I think there's going to be a lot of people here that are listening that are really excited in the journey that you've undertaken. And I think, do you know, as a pharmacist, it's really exciting to go from just being in your normal day-to-day role, but then actually getting into health tech, making a massive difference, and actually that scary jump from going from NHS to private. And I think that's something that a lot of us are a little bit wary about sometimes. How has that been for you? How have you navigated that change from NHS to private?
Yeah, I think it is really scary. And I had a lot of my family, for example, were even quite nervous about me making this change because the NHS is very comfortable and you sort of know what you're going to get, even if you're moving across different hospitals. And I'm sure it's the same in community as well. So I think I just went with an open mind. I was effectively a sponge. I spoke to as many people as I could, and I tried to learn what I could from every person because everyone had such a different role, but everyone was trying to go towards the common goal of what you were trying to build and trying to be successful. That I think just working well with people, collaborating, being a really good communicator is really the first step in making a success. And I think another thing that I noticed that's really important is you should never be saying no to someone's suggestion or idea. It's more like, how might we be able to do that? Or how can we? Again, a lot of people come in from a very much clinical risk angle, which is great, but you've got to work with the people that are trying to build something rather than trying to work against.
Yeah, I think that's something that is actually really, I think, enlightening, that kind of shift in mindset, because I've had a background in health tech as well, and it's actually moving away from actually there's so much risk associated with this, but how can we make this happen? What tools can we create to kind of make it safe and effective for us to be doing this in a digital healthcare setting? So I think that that's really a great bit of advice for anyone that is listening, just to be able to be open, not to say no to kind of anything that's coming your way, to learn from experiences. And as you say, talk to everyone that's around you because that's where you learn the most. Danielle, in terms of product, what is a role in clinical product? I think that there's a lot of people that might be listening and actually not be able to understand or not come from a health tech background that might not know what that means. Can you just explain a little bit about what clinical product means in like a healthcare setting?
Yeah, you definitely. And I think this is a really great question because clinical product is a growing discipline. And a lot of people do end up doing what I'd say is a clinical product role, but they don't have the clinical product title. So this sort of clinical product discipline, you'll see it quite frequently in various health tech companies, but they just might have different titles for their job. But clinical product really for me is about owning the clinical integrity of everything that the company is building towards. So you are an embedded member of the product and technology team, and you are bringing in new ideas into the team, whether that's guideline changes or new products as in new medications or new products as in new technologies. And you're looking at those, scrutinizing them with your clinical lens, understanding how they can be used in your product that you're building. And then you're also working with the product team for their ideas that they might have around how to change the flow, how to optimize the flow so there's a better patient experience or better patient engagement. And you're also the clinical voice in the room. So you are representing all of those clinicians that are working within the clinical operations team who are on the sort of the receiving end of your product, but they're also really a priority stakeholder because if you don't build a good product for the clinician, the patient experience will also not be as good as you want it to be. So you're representing the clinicians in the room, you're thinking about the clinical risk, and you're also weighing up what's the acceptance criteria for an MVP, so minimum viable product versus a V1 or a V2. And that might change as maybe something is okay for 10 people, but it's not okay for 100 or 1,000 people. And you're really weighing up the clinical risk and thinking about how that product can scale. But you're also doing the post-marketing surveillance as well. So once a product is out is released and is in production and is in front of patients, you're also doing the ongoing monitoring. So how is it performing? Is it performing as well as it should be? Not only from a risk perspective, but also is it doing its purpose? So are we getting the patient outcomes we expect? Are we getting the patient engagement and patient retention as well? So basically you're a clinical member that's making sure that everything that the product team is building has the right level of clinical scrutiny that it needs.
Okay, so that seems like a role that pharmacists really should excel in, and we have a great skill set to be able to apply or transfer it to this kind of role. So, is there an instance where you see that pharmacists are not so successful in this role?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So I do think pharmacists have a very good skill set for this role. And the reason I think have the right skill set is because we're great problem solvers. I think
Hmm.
throughout our training and through our career, we're sort of always we're great problem solvers and also great detectives. So we're always looking for what are patients telling us and also what are patients not telling us.
Yep.
What does the information say? What have other healthcare professionals managed to get out of the patient as well? And then you're also marrying that up with other pieces of information like their biomarker information, what do the diagnostics say, and things like that. So I think we're great detectives and then we're great problem solvers. But I think sometimes what pharmacists could work on, or what I see people perhaps don't do quite as well in interviews, is pharmacists sometimes don't work through that risk into how it can be possible. And sometimes will stick more towards a no answer rather than this is how we could do it if we tweak this and that. So it's always about showing your thinking out loud, I think is really important.
Yeah, I think for pharmacists in general, we're so used to working in SOPs. We're so used to working along the BNF guidelines, looking at what the SPC says. So sometimes our way of thinking can be a little bit rigid. So I think this is something that challenges you to think laterally and think outside of the box. So you have to look at it from all the other aspects, not just the clinical aspect, but actually, is the product user friendly? Is it reaching its outcomes that we set out for it to reach? So I think that's really useful. And I think that's really helpful for pharmacists that will be listening that are looking for that kind of role. Is there any advice that you would give to pharmacists, as you've probably sat in a number of interviews as well? What makes them do well in an interview process?
I'd say in general, having a good clinical background is sort of a given at the point that if you've managed to make it to interview, we've already screened your CV and we think you've got the right clinical acumen. And so I think in an interview, it's really important to show the thinking and show the application of that clinical background that you've got. So it's about, again, talking through the problem that you might have been given in the interview, thinking through pros and cons, what you might do, who you might talk to, who you might involve. It's very important to show how you're involving stakeholders, again, being open minded, but then also being able to make a decision at the end, because quite often, as the clinical product manager, the final decision on that clinical risk sits with you. And so it's sort of being able to show that you think outside the box, you're open, you collaborate, but you're also willing to make a final call at the end.
Okay, so it's really that decision making that you're looking for as well there. Danielle, for you, what does a normal kind of day to day look like in clinical product?
Yeah, so I think I can talk about sort of maybe a day-to-day clinical product and then maybe my role in clinical director now looks like. So for a clinical product manager, they'll be embedded in the squad. So they'll go to daily stand-ups with the product and engineering team. And that will be talking about their daily work that they're doing or the sprint that they're working within, what tickets are coming through, what might need clinical scrutiny, what might need QA. They'll also be looking at speaking to the clinical operations team and getting feedback on the current problems or feedback on some current ideas that we've got to make sure that there's nothing that they've missed in terms of what really goes on the ground. Because it's really important for clinical product to stay as current as possible with the clinical operations team. And the clinical product will also be speaking to certain pharma companies, the medical liaison from the pharma company to make sure that there's any new trial data to understand how that is going to affect the product that they're building. And also, they wear the clinical safety officer hat. So they'll be updating hazard logs, again, looking at all the clinical governance around the products and generally just working with the other clinical product team in everything that they're building as well. And then more from a clinical director point of view, I oversee the clinical product managers. So I will sort of coach those quite often. So clinical product is a role that most people may have not done it when they first enter the role at Numan. So I'll do a lot of coaching and one-to-ones in terms of talking through problems that each clinical product manager has and working with them on how they can solve those problems. And I'll oversee that from all of the different areas of clinical product at the company. I'll also be speaking to potential new partners, whether, again, that's new categories, medications, new technologies, talking to them about what innovation they have, how it might work for Numan, and whether there's any collaboration opportunities there. And then I'll also be, as I'm the registered manager from a CQC perspective as well, I'll oversee anything to do with clinical governance. So again, anything that's coming up from clinical product or clinical operations, instance complaints, and just overseeing those aspects and ensuring there's no issues there. But then a lot of my role is also as clinical director is working with the other functional leads. So that's the commercial director, product director, VP of engineering and marketing, and working together so that basically we can ensure that the company is working at pace and we can prevent any huge areas of friction where the teams are struggling to work. And really, we are the escalation point so that we can make sure that the company is operating as it should.
That's really exciting, actually. I think for a pharmacist to be working in a company as large as Numan, working on digital health, something that's making a real impact to probably millions of patients every day, it's really exciting to see how your role has developed. I think having a pharmacist as a clinical director of such a company is a really kind of exciting aspect for pharmacists. And I think you're doing an amazing job. If someone wanted to go into a clinical director role, what sets that apart from a normal role? What can they do? So, stepping back a little bit, what in your kind of journey did you do to get to a clinical director role?
At the beginning, obviously, just I think be open to learning, learn from whoever you can, and get involved in whatever you can as well. If it doesn't directly fit your job that you think you've gone for, but it sounds interesting and your manager is happy for you to go for it, then go for it. Very much it's about t-shirt size approach where you don't just always stay in your lane. You see what else there is that you can get involved in. And then I think start thinking about what you can add value for the company. And again, there's the clinical angle that you can stay within, but also what's the company trying to achieve and how can you come at that and help excel that as well. And it's also about, again, working with the other function leads like commercial and really getting that, improving your commercial acumen as well. I think that's something that is very new when people are leaving public sector, moving into private, is the commercial language. So becoming friends with anyone in commercial marketing or that aspect, so you can learn a lot about how they think and what their priorities are. And then you can start learning the things that you want to build that are important to you from a clinical point of view. You can start understanding how to translate that, the worth of that in their language. So you can start talking about a new product that you want to build, but through the lens of why that's good in a commercial aspect. And so I think in summary, get involved in what you can get involved in and start learning what's important to the other pieces of the company so that you can make sure that you translate well.
Yeah, I think in terms of personal and professional development, you've personally and professionally also developed in marketing in a kind of all these different areas. So it's taking every opportunity to expand that skill set that you have, not just sticking to clinical is what I do and clinical is what I know.
I'm
It's
a
actually,
pharmacist, that's it.
yeah,
Mm.
it's opening up like your mind really to say, I want to be able to learn this and this can make my role better. And I think we see it on a day-to-day basis that there's some people that just want to come in and they want to do their job, they want to do their 9 to 5. But
Mhm.
then there's some people that actually are like, okay, I want to build this, I want to do this. Have you thought about this? We could market this way, we could do this on social media. And I think it's really exciting to take every opportunity you have. And I think it goes to show that's something really exciting that you've done along your way.
Yeah, and I think that one more thing is that, and that's quite interesting. When I first got the clinical lead job, I wasn't going actually thinking, oh, this is what my career progression is going to look like. But
Yeah.
actually, once I was in that role and I just saw problems or I saw gaps and I could see that there was ways to fix them, and I was just really curious about learning about how things work, I just couldn't help myself but sort of get carried away. And I think that curiosity is really important, always asking why things are the way they are. If things don't quite
Mhm.
look right, probably because they're not, or they've just never been queried. So I think, yeah, always, if you find a trail, always go down that route and see what's going on.
Yeah, and I think as well, for anyone that's listening, it's okay not to have that straight away. I think sometimes with time and experience that builds, and that confidence to actually make those suggestions and that thought process come. But I think actually just going in with a really open mind and being open to learn and experience everything new in a private sector that you never had experience in before is something that is just very inspiring.
Yeah, I feel like it's that sort of approach to how you've tackled your sort of career path is you've basically sort of created your own role. I feel like as you've stepped up, the more you've identified, you've sort of developed yourself as well. I mean, have there been any sort of challenges to get to where you are? Is there anything that you would have done differently?
Well, one thing, especially when I took the clinical director role, that I thought that I wasn't very good at and perhaps I wasn't that interested in was actually a lot on the sort of the public affairs side and the sort of the policy side and the government side. And I just thought, well, that's part of the role, but it's just something that I'm not good at and I'm not interested in, or vice versa. I'm not interested in, therefore I'm not good at, but I'll have a go. But actually, over the last 9 months of being in this role, as I've learned more and more, especially about obesity, because that's a large area of the treatment area that I lead on, I've really learned about obesity as a disease and also how policy at government level can really impact, obviously, funding and obesity that can then really impact care and how patients experience care. And because I found that a lot more interesting, I've then become more interested in what's going on at government level or policy level and become more interested about speaking up where I feel like there's things need to change. So that's been something that I've grown a lot in over the last 6 months or so, which surprised me actually.
Yeah, that's amazing. I feel like I said, you're paving your own way. So what's next, do you think, for you?
Oh, interesting. I think I'm at Numan, I'm establishing my role as clinical director, and I want to really strengthen the clinical product team and grow that team because we've got a lot of new people there. So, really build that clinical product discipline at Numan. But then also more personally, because I think clinical product is still a really underdefined discipline, I've started writing about clinical product on my website, clinicalproduct.uk, and also on my Substack. So that's where I'm starting to write. I've written a foundation series on what clinical product is. And I'm now moving on to a translation series where I've started interviewing different functions like commercial and product, talking to them about how they work with clinical product and what are the important skills that they would like to see from clinical product. And then moving on in autumn, I'm co-founding the Clinical Product School with Louise Ricks, where we're launching a online clinical product module where we'll be doing a training program so that we can basically pass on that learning that we have got about clinical product onto people that are interested in the area. I think like when I started in clinical product, there was no training pathway that existed and sort of pretty much made it up as I went along sort of thing. And there was also no one senior to escalate to and no one to speak to. So I think we've identified that there's a really big gap now. There's a lot of people wanting to move into clinical product. And so we would like to pass down that knowledge. And so that's why we started the Clinical Product School.
I think that's great. I think there's going to be so many pharmacists that are interested in that because I think there's a lot of people that do want to get into digital health tech and into all of the alternative roles that are available at the moment. And I think people just don't know where to start. So having that available from someone that's done it from like the beginning, very early in a really large company to where it is now, I think that will be super useful for a lot of pharmacists. When did you say that will be available? Is that kind of autumn?
Yeah, so we'll be looking to launch September, October time. I'll be putting it up on my LinkedIn, also on my Substack and website. So keep an eye out. Encourage anyone that's interested to subscribe. So my website's clinicalproduct.uk, and then I'll be posting any updates on there.
Amazing. So, Danielle, I'm sure you probably get asked this a lot. So, if anyone wanted to kind of transition out of a more traditional role to go into digital healthcare, whether it's operations, whether it's clinical product, what advice would you give them on that transition?
Yeah, I'd say I get asked a lot of questions around what can someone do in their current role that will help set them up for a future clinical product role. So I'd say, firstly, obviously, as a pharmacist, if you haven't got your independent prescribing, I would go for it. I think that paves the way for either stepping into a private company where you can prescribe on the clinical operations side. And even if you're doing that as a contractor a couple of hours a week, it puts a foot into the private side. You start seeing how that company works and you start getting a bit of a feel for it. And also, if there were any opportunities, they might come your way a little bit quicker. But I'd also say in current roles, obviously, pharmacists are always doing audits and quality improvement projects. And I think a really important part of those projects are the actions at the end and making sure those actions are actually seen through so that you're actually making a change into whatever it was that you were auditing or trying to improve. Because that's what we do all the time in clinical product. One of the first things I noticed at Numan was that we were unable to prescribe for a lot of people and sending them away because we didn't stock a certain dose of medication. And I did that. I noticed that through an audit. And it just took a couple of conversations with the superintendent pharmacist and with commercial to understand that this was just something that we've just never been brought up. And so we added that drug and the dose onto our formulary. And then I added it to our SOP and we could start prescribing. And that was just a simple audit that I'd done, but actually seeing that through allowed us to take on more patients and treat more patients. But also there was obviously a big commercial side of that as well, because we weren't sending people away back to their GP. So even a small audit that you think perhaps is just a tick box, it's not. Really look into it and look at how you could change the product because of it.
Okay, that's interesting. I've just thought of another couple of questions actually that might be useful. So, you've done a few different roles throughout your digital health experience. So, you mentioned that you were in operations as well. So, what's the difference between the clinical product role and the operations role? So, if anyone is looking to find out what's more suitable for them, what is the difference and who may be suited for each kind of role?
Yeah, so it's clinical product and clinical operations are distinct roles, but they also must work really closely together to be successful. So clinical product is on the ideas side of the product. So when we say product, if you think about an end-to-end clinical pathway, for example, so an obesity pathway, we can call that a product. So the clinical product person is thinking about obesity. What does that end-to-end flow look like? Who do we treat? How do we treat? How often are the touch points involved in the program? How often do we reach out to patients? And what's all of the underlying technology that the clinical pathway is built on as well? So clinical product will understand the different platforms that the pathway is running on and will understand the logic behind that and also edge cases that might come up because of that. Whereas clinical operations is looking at, so they've got this program, they are treating these patients in that way that has been determined. And how best can they do that in an efficient way? And also that's delivering the best patient experience. So if you're a clinical operations lead, for example, you'll be managing that team of clinicians. That might be prescribing pharmacists or pharmacy technicians, nurses, doctors, and you'll be looking at which role is right for which activity so that you can get the right competency. And also, obviously, from a financial perspective, you're not spending too much money on a role where it could be a different role delivering it. And you'll also be looking at the data a lot. So in clinical operations, you need to be really data driven, looking at all of the different dashboards. Where are there high friction points? Where are there blockers? Where perhaps do you not have capacity to manage the number of requests coming in and sort of managing that team. So clinical operations might see a high friction point that needs to be changed in the product and we'll go and speak to clinical product about it. or they might see that actually there's an opportunity here to tweak themselves because it doesn't really require a big product change and they can do that themselves. So clinical operations is a lot more operational, data driven, and also working with a huge team of clinicians.
Perfect. I think that will be really interesting for people that are listening to go and see if they are looking for a role in digital health, like where their kind of skill sets fit in. Because I think sometimes it's really difficult. You hear about roles that you've probably never heard of before when you're used to being in such a traditional pharmacy model. So I think we are very well equipped with our skill sets to be doing these roles, but just figuring out where our personal skill sets is on top of our clinical skill sets are, that's a really key differentiator. Okay, before I continue and keep you here for hours, Danielle, last question. Any regrets swapping to private healthcare?
Oh, definitely not. No, I'm
Yeah.
I'm challenged on a day-to-day basis. It's definitely a different challenge than I had in acute medicine,
Yeah.
but it's still a challenge. There's
Mhm.
still huge prioritization calls, and it's always really interesting. And I get to work with a great team of clinicians, but I also work with a great team of non-clinicians, and we're all still always trying to get to the same goal. And you actually feel like you're making a bigger impact on patients' lives than I did when I worked in the NHS.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of red tape that comes off, and you're able to see the statistics of your impact a lot sooner than you can probably in a kind of an NHS setting. Have you found that swapping to a private healthcare role has had any kind of, any challenges or stopped you from achieving anything that you've wanted to achieve?
No, I actually think everyone is very supportive about your self-development as well.
Yeah.
So I don't feel like I've ever had anyone stopping me in trying to achieve what I wanted to achieve. No, it's always been very adapting to what you want to do, what you want to get out of it. And I think there's more flexibility in finding a role that suits you, suits your skill set, suits where you're trying to get to. So yeah, no, definitely not.
Yeah, I think it's a very fast-paced environment in comparison to what we're used to in the NHS. So I think you're constantly learning, you're constantly trying to find out what's next. And I think it's really nice to not just be in that traditional just clinician. You're working with a whole different group of people where you have a whole different group of skill sets. So whether it's coming from IT team and engineers to marketing to media, you've got a whole different group of people to be learning on. So I really think that it helps to expand and broaden those skill sets. Okay,
Yeah.
Danielle, before I keep you here, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights. I think this episode is going to be particularly useful and particularly topical to pharmacists that are looking to transition into digital health. I think getting to know what different roles are out there and how pharmacist skill sets are really kind of important to these roles and help to grow these roles is a really important conversation. I think it really highlights that we do have the right skill sets, which if we are there and open to developing in other aspects, this role is really important for us. Thank you to all of those that are listening today. We hope this episode has given you a little bit more awareness and confidence when it comes to navigating digital health. And as always, no gatekeeping, just honest conversations. So we hope to see you in the next episode of the Clinical Pharmacist podcast.